Well, greetings on behalf of Creation Ministries International this morning. My name's Andrew Snowden, and usually at these events, when we're invited to speak, one of our highly qualified scientists who've done many, often hundreds of public talks, comes and speaks. And some of you may have heard, I think in recent times we've had Dr. Mark Harwood has come to Canberra. Some of you may have heard Mark. And Dr. Ron Neller has been here giving a number of talks. Some of you may have heard him or one of our other speakers. But today I'm coming and speaking to you. And our organisation is best known probably for our website, creation.com. And we have all kinds of interesting articles up there every day. There's lots of fascinating information on our website and lots of interesting topics that you can drill into. But my background, I'm not, and this is good for you all to know, I'm not a scientist. I've been working with Creation Ministries International as the leader of the volunteers group in Canberra, which we call a Friends group, for some 30 years. And I've been following this topic very closely during that time. I've read a few books. I've listened to hundreds of talks. And so today is some of my thinking of these last decades on this topic. And I hope that it's going to give you, those of you who've heard, like Stan has many creation talks before, a fresh perspective. And I hope also that it gives you a little bit of courage, because my work is connected to the construction industry, and yet I've been able to get on top of this topic. And so hopefully you won't feel overawed by it and you think, maybe I can learn something about that too. So my talk today, does God have an identity crisis? Obviously God doesn't have an identity crisis. I just thought it'd be a funny name. But we're going to be talking about God, the Bible, history and science. And I've got 3 parts to the talk. Part 1 is about God, the Bible, history and science. Part 2, we're going to look at the world around us and how our belief as Christians affects the things that we see just all around us in the world, and a different perspective that it gives us believing in God, the Creator. And part 3, we're going to talk about Jesus, the Creator. And each of those sections will probably be about 15 minutes. And as I give this talk, I'm assuming that I'm talking to Christians, people who believe in the Bible, and the Bible is God's written message to all of humanity. So I'm not going to be defending the Bible, I'm going to be arguing from it. One of the most important aspects of God's identity is that He's the Creator. And you can see that in this passage here in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the Creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. And I could go to many places in the scriptures, and you can probably think of many of them, where this point is made. Who is the God that we worship? He is the Creator. We see this again in going to a completely different passage. We've popped over to the book of Revelation, chapter 4, 9 to 11. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honour and thanks to Him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before Him who is seated on the throne and worship Him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." And what's interesting is I've talked to Christians over the years, all Christians agree. Who is God? God is the Creator. But strangely, when it comes to the question of origins, how did we all get here? How did the universe exist? Where does human life come from? Those kind of questions. Not all Christians agree about what it means that God created. It's sort of the fine print is where the question is. But everyone believes that God is the Creator. So I thought these are a few of my thinkings of what does it mean that God is creator. And you could add other things to this list, but looking at these passages and other similar ones, we come up with things like this. God is not himself a part of the creation. We call this the creator-creature distinction. God speaks. God is not silent. He's a God who communicates to us. The creation reflects God's will. There's a divine purpose. The universe had a beginning. Everything was made from nothing. And here's a very important one with great moral implications, and is the major reason why people don't want to hear this message. God owns everything. It means he sets the rules. We are his image bearers. Life itself belongs to God. God ordains and defines sexuality, and God designed everything. He understands everything. That's what I think some of the important things that it means when we say God is creator. Now, what's interesting as Christians is our Christian faith, our religion, is a matter of history. You see, we believe in an actual man named Jesus, that he lived in Israel 2 millennia ago, that he died at a point in history, and on the third day, he rose again. And I'm going to come back to this point about history shortly. But I just want to say the reason it matters is the way thinking is sort of layered. The way we think about the transcendent, what is ultimate, what we as Christians would put God in that place. But everyone has something in that place of what is transcendent and what is ultimate. And whatever they put in that place, their theology, will determine then the next layer, which is what they think man is, how they define humankind, or their anthropology. The whole view of man is going to be within what they think is ultimate. And then all of those two things shape our worldview, or all the other ologies and isms. They're all shaped by what we think a man is, what it means to be human, and what is ultimate. Now, the very idea that God created the world is a supernatural idea. Opposed to this are man-centered efforts to explain existence that are based on a different belief system called naturalism. Naturalism is an explicit denial of supernaturalism. I think you can understand that there can't be sort of a semi-supernaturalism. God made the world or God didn't make the world. There's no in-between position. They're mutually exclusive. And some of you are probably thinking, well, what about the idea of theistic evolution? Because that is actually an attempt. Theistic evolution is this idea that God used evolution. It's a kind of trying to put naturalism and supernaturalism together. But really, I would argue it's just naturalism plus a God out there somewhere. And it really denies that God is close and evolved with his creation. So I want to think about naturalism for a minute. When you start from naturalism and you do biology, what do you get? Well, you get evolution, or some sort of story about how everything made itself. And if you start from naturalism and you do astronomy, you look out into space, you theorize about how it all got there and do cosmology, what do you get? Well, you get the Big Bang. Or you get some kind of story of how the universe is the result of natural processes, because that's where you started. And if you start from naturalism and you do geology, what do you get? Well, you get great eons of time, deep time with its billions and millions of years. All of that connects to Big Bang cosmology, and of course it's essential for any sort of theory of evolution. You have to have all of that time. And the problem is that biology, cosmology, geology, they can be science. But they can also be a philosophy of history, opposed to Christian belief, masquerading as scientific fact. They could be either of those. You see, science is not a pure search for truth that produces facts. Maybe it could be if people weren't involved. In practice, a scientist is guided by their belief system, what they choose to study, what questions they're going to ask in their study, what data they're going to collect, what data they're going to exclude, and most importantly, how they're going to interpret the data. So we think of science sort of like a machine where you put data in, you turn the handle, and facts come out. But the reality is the scientist chooses what data's going in, and what's feeding in the bottom is his ideas. It might be his naturalism, his philosophy is feeding in as the paper, and it's pre-printed with something on there. And everything else he's adding goes onto that, and it all fits to what he already thought to start with. So when you turn the handle, if you start with naturalism, guess what? You'll always get something that agrees with what you thought was true to start with. So I said that science can be a philosophy of history masquerading as scientific fact. And I believe that Creation Ministries International and creationists in general have no disagreement with scientists around the world over matters of science. Our disagreement is about history. Now, the thing is, of course, you've got to realise people who are committed to naturalism, they like to paint the disagreement as a matter of their science versus our faith. But it's really dishonest because they're not being honest about the fact that it's not their science that's speaking, it's their naturalism. And that they're really teaching history, but they're branding it as science. We've heard a bit of that lately, haven't we? All scientists agree when you censor the ones that don't. It's clear to me, and I'd love to have time to go into this, but when you look at the history of geology and the scientists who led the charge to the kind of thinking that is just all around the world in geology today, you go back a couple of hundred years, it's very clear that they had an agenda to attack the foundations of Christianity by undermining the history of our faith. Unfortunately, many Christians don't realise what they lose if they don't defend history. Many say the age of creation, it doesn't matter. What matters is the gospel. But you can't separate those so easily. It's not that it's not true. It is true the gospel is what's important. That's the whole point. But the reason that we know about Christ and the church is from the New Testament. And the New Testament and the Old Testament are interwoven, so that if the Old Testament isn't true, then either is the New Testament. Jesus fulfills Old Testament types and prophecies. You know, we've got the book of Matthew, and this happened to fulfill what was spoken, right? All of that. There's all those connections. So without the Bible, there's no Abraham. There's no Moses. There's no law of God. There's no King David. There's no prophets or priests. There's no actual Jesus, no resurrection, no miracles, no sin, and no salvation. I think we all understand that the New Testament is history, and we look at the books of Kings and Chronicles, even the prophets. We've got battles in Isaiah and Jeremiah. They record events and people of history. I recently had the privilege to catch up with an old friend by the name of Andre, and he was telling me about his trips back to Iraq where he grew up, and he visited the tomb of Daniel. Now, I didn't know you could visit it. And also Mordecai and Esther. Unfortunately, I don't have any of his photos to share, but you can look it up on the internet and see those places. People that we know from history, and their tombs are still with us. So what about the book of Genesis? Is Genesis history? Well, what's most of the book of Genesis about? It's about Abraham. Abraham's introduced as the 9th generation after Noah's son Shem in chapter 11. It lists all of the descendants from Shem down to to Abraham. And then from chapters 12 through to the end at chapter 50, we've got the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and it finishes with Joseph's death and embalming as the last verse of chapter 50. I have another friend who's now deceased, Paul Saberton, and he told me of a time where he visited the old city of Hebron, is where the cave of the patriarchs is. And you can't visit there as a Christian safely these days. I don't know if you could get there at all, but Abraham and Isaac, their wives, some of them, they're buried in this place. And of course, there's a picture of how it looks today. There's a mosque been built over it in centuries gone by. And of course, the reason that it's a place that's been reserved is Abraham is precious to Christians, Jews, Muslims. They all venerate Abraham. And so the place is still there. And if those who's visited Israel, you know that every old sacred place has got things built on top of things, built on top of things, built on top of things in the time since then. But if you follow what we call the chronogenealogies of Genesis, you know, in Genesis 5 and 11, it lists the descendants and it gives you the time gap between each of those. And if you add that up, you get roughly Abraham comes on the scene 2,000 years after creation, and approximately from Abraham to Jesus Christ is also a period of about 2,000 years. And what that means in terms of the flow of the Bible is that from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11 covers a period of roughly the first third of history. And then from Genesis 12 through to Matthew is sort of the next third of history, which means we've got a lot of data on that middle third of history. And it's why Genesis 1 to 11 is so precious to us, because it's the only window we really have of that world before the world was destroyed by a flood. And so we don't know a lot about it. We've got 11 chapters, but what we know is very, very precious. Now, I did a search just recently. I went online and I searched for prehistoric animals, and this came up. And of course, they're all artistic impressions, and some of them are artistic impressions that are very imaginary, and others are things that were buried in fossils at some point. But I would contend that if the Bible is true, and this is going to go, you know, when you've gone to school as a little kid, you've been taught things that are just in the back of your head and you just assume they're true, and I want you to question them today, because if the Bible is true, there is no such thing as prehistoric. History starts in Genesis 1:1, and we have a record of what happened since then. Mankind is made on day 6. And Jesus talked, when he's talking about marriage, you know, from the beginning, he made them male and female. So that was the beginning. So part of our work as Christ's ambassadors, I think, is to also defend the historicity of the Bible. I think that's an important part of it. So let's go to part 2, and I'm going to just look at 2 quick examples of where this conflict plays out in the world that's all around us. This is from 2 articles from Creation magazine, and I'll tell you a bit about that later, but we have a print and a digital edition, and I just did a screenshot out of the digital edition, which you can't read, but it looks like that. And I'm just going to give you a quick summary of this first article. This is in our little news section at the beginning. They dug in some rocks, and rather than looking for fossils, they actually were looking for genetic material, and they stuck it all in their samples in and looked for DNA, and then tried to match that up with their DNA library to say, well, can we work out what creatures were living here? And they did find some, and they matched up, and they basically said, look, we found a whole ecosystem. We've got a bunch of different kinds of trees, and we've got some different shrubs. What have we got there? And mastodons, reindeer, rodents, geese, marine species, including horseshoe crabs and green algae. Things that actually we've got no ecosystem where those things live together were all found here. But here's the problem. They've found DNA. Now, in your cells, DNA is a very complex molecule, and very fragile. You actually have machines that are working overtime, repairing your DNA every moment of every day because it gets damaged all the time. And it's got these elaborate machines that repair it to keep you alive. And guess what? When you're dead, that's not working anymore. And not only that, once the cell membrane is broken, it's open to the elements. The chance of it lasting very long is not very good. And they reckon that this sediment that they're digging these samples out of is millions of years old. Well, hang on. How does it last for millions of years? Well, they're going to have to try and dream up some answer of how it lasts millions of years, because otherwise they'd have to abandon their naturalism, wouldn't they? So that's exactly, but what a big problem that is. The other article, and I actually copied the, there's a little button in the magazine, in the digital version, you can click on that gives you a reader view, where it's just got the text rather than the actual print view, which is much easier to see. But it says at the beginning there, the first paragraph's up the top there. Sorry, bumping. If I get it just right, I can still read it anyway. In 2021, I've changed it, haven't I? I sound different now. What have I done? How about like that? In 2021, Zhang et al. Now that's Latin for a bunch of scientists, and the first one on the list, his surname was Zhang. They reported on foot and hand impressions, which are roughly, as you can see there, from a fossil hot spring on the Tibetan plateau. They interpreted these as a deliberate artistic act by the track makers, likely children. Then they used a form of uranium dating, and they said that the travertine with the imprints was between 169 and 226,000 years old. Somewhere in between there. We'll round it and we'll call it, for the sake of the argument, 200,000 years. Fairly old. Thus, it was claimed that the site was the earliest known example of cave art in the world. And of course, there's a lot of kudos in folding the oldest one. Second oldest doesn't count for much, but if you've got the oldest one, that's really something. Also, that the site provides evidence of the earliest known presence of human-like creatures above 4,000 metres on the high Tibetan plateau. Well, lo and behold, the story seems to have unravelled after further analysis by another bunch of scientists, one of whose name is Tang, published last year, so 3 years later. And they say that the uranium-thorium dates at this site are inconsistent with another dating method called thermoluminescence, which gave a date of 20,000 years for foot and handprints at a second site nearby. But even that date is way too old because the second site contains finger-drawn Tibetan letters. And the Tibetan script was only introduced in the 7th century AD. Now, if we do the maths, I got a feeling that 200,000 years ago is probably not AD. It's probably BC sometime, isn't it? Yeah, so that doesn't seem to agree. They say that the prints and the Tibetan inscription at the second site were made at the same time because both were made in the still soft precipitate, which they point out was no earlier than 1,300 years ago. Hence, they ask whether the similar prints at the first site could possibly be in the order of 200 times older. Well, I agree. They conclude their excellent state of preservation contradicts the sensational proposition emphatically. So what we've got here is one dating method gives you a date of 20 times older than what the age must be from the letters, and the other one is 200 times older. So which is right? Well, these are the kind of problems that you get when you try and impose a naturalistic framework on a world that's actually not made that way. It creates these kind of problems. So what I'm going to do, the question I'm asking is, well, when you go on a holiday and you look at the rocks, we recently went down to the Grampians when it was still there and saw all the rocks there. And the question is, what does it look like? Does it look old or does it look young? So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of Australia courtesy of the National Rock Garden. I didn't click through all of that, sorry. Courtesy of the National Rock Garden, which was at the western end of Lake Burley-Griffin, with a series of rocks from each state and territory called the Federation Rocks. And that's a homeschool group that we took down there. Now, has anyone seen those rocks there? Sorry, they're not there now. So you can't go and have a look. They've moved them away. I got a feeling that it's part of their plan to actually build a great big centre there, and the rocks will be back with a vengeance. But we're going to have a little quick look at some of those. So you can't see on that. There's little smiley faces around the different states of where the particular rocks come from. But from New South Wales, we've got what's called the Hawkesbury Sandstone. And they don't call it the Sydney Sandstone because apparently the Sydney Sandstone is in Canada. So it's the Hawkesbury Sandstone. And there's a plaque on there which I didn't have a really good photo of, but I know what it says anyway. The Middle Triassic, it says, this rock is classified as Middle Triassic. Braided rivers carried vast quantities of quartz-rich sands. Just want you to remember those words. I'm going to flash through some of the other states and look for similar kind of words. But we've just been on a holiday up in the Hunter Valley, and everywhere we went we saw sandstone. This is a building built out of sandstone. We went to Munmora and up into Mount Royal National Park. We saw sandstone. One of many beaches we went at, there's sandstone all along the beach there. We went to Sydney and down into Lane Cove. We went to Killara, across the road from where my wife Laura grew up. And there's lots of sandstone everywhere. And especially, who's been to Caves Beach? What a beautiful place. If you haven't been there, you should go. You've got near Newcastle, and you've got to get there when the tide's out to actually get in. There's these beautiful big, some of the layers are very soft, which is why they've eroded away preferentially, leaving these big caves. And when you get close up, there's lots of different layers in the sandstone. You've got light layers, dark layers, coarse and fine. And I'm going to zoom in on the little bit above Laura's head there, which is light coloured. I don't know if you can see it from that far away, but in that light coloured layer, there's banding, which are diagonal lines. And when you look to Laura's left, there's a very coarse layer, which has got sort of little pebbles in it, and it's also got the diagonal lines through it. Now, those lines in geology are called cross-bedding. And what happens is you've got fast-flowing water is carrying sediment that's been eroded from somewhere. So it's sloshing along, carrying all this sediment, and there's a change in the depth, or maybe some water coming from a different direction causes the water to slow down a little bit. And as it does, it drops its sediment load. And as it drops it down the diagonal slope so that the sediment forms sideways. So the sediment closer to Laura was formed first, and the sediment further away is formed second, and down the diagonal slope from the top to the bottom of that layer is all the same age. And the difference between them is a matter of minutes. So the sediment is deposited very, very quickly. Now, the sandstone of the Sydney Basin, it covers an area roughly Kiama to Newcastle out to Katoomba. It's a vast area. The overall Sydney Basin that includes this sandstone layer is up to about 6 kilometres deep. So there's a lot of sediment in there, individual strata, and when you drive to Sydney, have a look in those cuttings and you'll easily see different layers of sandstone and the diagonal cross-bedding in those beds. It's quite easy to see if you're a passenger. And the layers, well, some of the layers we saw there were as small as 10 centimetres, but it's very common them to be sort of half a metre. Some of them can be as big as 1.5 metres. And the sand is deposited by water. And it says on the plaque there at the where all these rocks are, that each rock's got a plaque. It says that the sand was compressed and hardened. Now, if you compress sand, what you get is compressed sand. For it to harden, you actually need, who's ever made concrete? What do you need? You need cement. And you've got to mix that through in a solution. So to make this much sandstone that we saw all across that part of New South Wales, you need a very big concrete mixer and a lot of water and a lot of energy to lay all that down. Because the layers are not like, if I mix up over millions of years one concrete mixer load at a time, it would look like lots of little piles, but it doesn't. You've got one layer that can stretch vast distances. So each layer has got a huge lateral extent, which indicates that there was a lot of it being deposited at once. And I think, did I go backwards? I went backwards. So we've got layers like this. What's the deepest sedimentary deposits on record? Well, my good friend Dr. Ron Neller, that's his specialty. He's studied river systems around the world and tried to drown in most of them, he'll tell you. He's got quite a few adventures as what's called a fluvial geomorphologist, and he studies sediment. And he said the deepest, let me get the words right here because it's important. I have no idea where I'm up to. The deepest river sediment deposit on record globally from a single flood event. Now, you can get little spots where it's deeper, but in terms of the overall spread of sediment from a flood, the deepest is 10 centimetres. A lot of people are surprised by that because we often see things like after the tsunami in Japan. It looks like everything's covered. He said it's just a very thin veneer is all that changes the colour of things. It's usually just a matter of millimetres. And he's studied rivers, he spent a long time studying in China, in the Amazon. He studied big rivers and he spent his life chasing floods. And they have many thousands of measuring stations around the world that they get this data from. So what explains the kind of thing that we actually saw? Something happened in the past that was not like processes that we see today. Tasmania, they have the rock called the dolerite. Their plaque there says that during the breakup of the ancient supercontinent, dolerite magma was injected as subsurface under the surface across most of Tasmania. The dolerite has been the thing about, there's the little plaque. The thing about the dolerite, if you've ever been to Tasmania, Mount Wellington, Cradle Mountain, all of those big features are dolerite. It's a really bad building rock. It is just too hard to work with. It's an incredibly hard rock. But there's something like 15,000 cubic kilometres of dolerite being injected into the surface that makes up Tasmania. So there's a lot of energy gone into that, another high energy process. And not only that, but what we see has been uncovered. It's been eroded and weathered by either a lot of force or a lot of time. If you're naturalist, you have to say which. That it has to be a lot of time, of course. In the Western Australia, the Bandon Iron Formation in the Pilbara, up in the Hamersley Range, and the particular important text on that one is it says, this banded iron was deposited from dissolved ferrous iron in the circulating waters of an early global ocean. Isn't that interesting? The Hamersley Range, with its, this one formation, it covers the width of the deposit is about half the width of Western Australia. And the depth of the overall supergroup is a number of kilometres. And these rocks are claimed to be the oldest rocks in Australia, 2.5 billion years or something rather like that. So all underwater. In South Australia, this particular rock has been altered by hydrothermal fluids. So hot water has been percolating through the rock and transformed the original minerals that are deposited into new minerals in the rock now. And of course it's mined because of its copper and all the beautiful, in fact they polish it up and it's a beautiful looking rock. God has made so many wonderful things through a destructive process of judgment in the flood. In Victoria, we've got in Bendigo and Ballarat, as it says there, the lower rock was deposited as sand and mud in the ocean off eastern Australia during the Ordovician. In the early Silurian, the sand and mud pile was folded and metamorphosed, so changed by heating, and injected with hot silica-containing fluids to form white quartz veins, and of course that's where all the gold is. That is why they've studied the rocks in the first place. It's only the gold they're really interested in. They don't really care how the rocks got there. But it's interesting that we've got sand and mud piles that have been folded, it's been injected, and there's... So what have we got there? We've got great earth movements, and we've got a lot of heating of the rocks, probably means that there's some volcanism going on and so on. And we've got deposition of sand and mud. Queensland, the Chinaman Creek limestone, way up north. The limestone, it says, formed in a tropical shallow marine environment. Now, of course, they don't really know how deep the water was, but they just know that this is where corals form today, and we've got limestone, and these kind of formations today form in that kind of environment, so they think that that's what it was. And again, this Chinaman Creek limestone, it's part of a bigger sedimentary unit known as the Broken River Group, and that can be up to 2 kilometres thick. So we've got a lot of sediment laid down up there as well, and somehow it seems to be that water is always involved. I've skipped Northern Territory, it's a complex story there, but in the Australian Capital Territory, the reason we have Limestone Avenue is because in Canberra there's actually limestone, which is part of the reason they built it here, because they needed to find lime to be able to make bricks and build and so on. So it was something they were looking for. And the limestone formed in warm, shallow tropical seas when Australia was part of Gondwana supercontinent. It contains occasional fragments of coral and shell. Notice fragments, so they're broken up. And I think that tells us that there's a high energy process that's carrying these fragments. Maybe they weren't formed as reefs like we see today in the Great Barrier Reef, calm and gently in warm seas. Canberra, of course, is on the Great Dividing Range, but it was underwater. So what do we see when we put all of that together? I think what we see is that Australia is a country that's been shaped by water. And I didn't really go into detail, but it's interesting to actually look into the details there, and I think you see high energy processes. And the reason that's important is that if there are high energy processes, you don't need much time. See, if the things happened by low energy processes, then they're right. There must have been a long time. They have evidence of a long time period if they're low energy processes. But I think the structures themselves defy that explanation. I think that the very structures themselves show high energy processes. So where's the time then? And the energy that's involved is not like anything that we see happening on Earth today. And of course the point of that is, I don't need to talk about evolution now, because if the Earth was made rapidly and quickly, there is no time for evolution, is there? So the third part of my talk, I just wanted to move on to talk about Jesus and answer another couple of important related questions. Just, by the way, there's rock everywhere. And big layers. All around the world. I could have picked any continent and told the same story. But back to our verse at the beginning. You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. God's supremacy and worship is caused by and follows his identity and ability as creator. That's what that verse is saying. And it tells us plainly that all things were created. If we're Christians, we have to believe that, don't we? But what does it mean? Can it include the evolution of the universe over deep time? Can it include evolution of life? Because some people say, yeah, God created, but maybe he did it by evolution. Well, is that a possibility? I'm going to answer that question from a different way of what you're used to hearing. I think the answer is plain from the miracles of Jesus. Just think about it. How did Jesus turn water into wine? How long did that take? How long does it take to make wine? How long did it take Jesus to make wine? How long did it take for the storm on Galilee to become calm? How long did it take for Lazarus to rise from the dead? For the Syrophoenician woman's child to be delivered from demons? For the lame to walk and the blind to see? He spoke, and it was. Jesus is the living word of God. His miracles were creative. He made something from nothing. There's an apologist who I very much admire. His name's William Lane Craig, and he's got very many good arguments for the Christian faith. But I disagree with him when he comes to talk about creation. He says that the days of creation must have been long periods of time. And two arguments that I heard him use were, well, it says that God separated the water from the land, and it takes time for land to dry out. Well, that's true. It does. But what does the scripture say? You read the actual text, it says he made dry land appear. He made dry land appear. Well, can God do that? Well, what happened when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea or the Jordan River? Did they walk on muddy ground? No, it tells us they walked on dry land. And it does say that there was a wind blew and it took a little bit of time, but a little bit of time, and there was dry land. And normally those things don't dry out that quickly, do they? It was a miracle. William Lane Craig also says that it must have been more than 24 hours because it says there were plants with seed and fruit and all this sort of stuff produced, and that takes time. Well, does it? Does anyone know the story about Aaron and his rod budding? I really encourage you to... a slide for that? Yeah. I really encourage you to go and read from Numbers 16, verse 41 and onwards. It's a fascinating story because Israel's been rebelling against Moses, and there's been such a rebellion that God kills a whole lot of them. And the very next day, they're saying, Moses, you're killing God's people. You shouldn't be the leader. The very next day. And so God says, well, let's see who should be leader. All you tribal heads, you bring your staff and you put them before the Ark of the Covenant overnight. And I'm going to do a miracle. One of them is going to bud. And look what it says there. So he puts them there at the night and he goes back next morning. And I think Moses was an early riser. The next day, Moses went into the tent of testimony, and behold, the staff of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms and bore ripe almonds. Maybe William Lane Craig hasn't read that bit of scripture. Maybe he hasn't read it yet. It doesn't really take a long time for God, does it? It was a miracle. God doesn't need time to create. He's operating in a different dimension, and it seems out there he's got all the time he wants. Here's one I made before. I don't know. But here's the take-home message. You can tell if something was done by God because it can happen in an instant, and he just speaks. So there's a real significance here that the miracles of Jesus, he did those miracles to show that he was God. He could speak, and it was done. And he had command over the natural world. So I think I conclude from that did God use a slow process? That's not his way of doing things, is it? And I think the beautiful thing about realizing that it was just thousands of years ago that God made the world, although that's a very long time, it's quite contrary to the idea that the world is billions of years old. Because in that view, where was humanity for all of that time? We're just a little blip on the end of time. And God is out there distant in space. But the reality is God is very near. God has always been very close, always been very involved in his creation. And I think that gives us a different perspective. I think it does matter, and that it gives us a different perspective of the kind of God that we serve, someone who's involved, someone who's close. and someone who's always present. Well, if you want to find more about any of these things, we have brought a few little resources along. They're out in the room where there's tea and coffee. We've got some things set up there. I was going to mention a couple. In a moment, I'm going to ask if there's anyone's got any questions. So it can be questions about something that I said, you think, well, hang on, Andrew, that just doesn't seem right because, and you've got something that's not sitting right, or maybe you think I just said something wrong. Let's talk about that. Or maybe you've got a completely unrelated question that you've always wanted to ask, something about creation. When we do that, nearly all the questions people ask are already answered in the Creation Answers book, which is why we have it. The book is $19, but the best way to get it, if you haven't got into this topic before, is to get the intro pack, where you also get the little book Refuting Evolution, which just explains about evolution and what's wrong with it, and a great video by our speaker, Dr. Mark Harwood, a DVD by him called A Brief But True History of Time. And you get the whole lot for $35 instead of just the book for $19. We've also got a whole lot of little books. This one here, The Genesis Flood, $5. If you've got small questions, get the small book. If you've got big questions, you can get the whole book. And it's a great book to have as a resource there. The other thing that I recommend, I'll go to questions in just a moment. Well, you've got a question about the books. I'll go to your questions in just a moment. I just want to say the other thing that I really recommend is the Creation magazine. I should have a slide for that. Beautiful colour magazine. There's no advertising in it. It's just all information. It's written so that it's easy to understand for anyone, and it comes out 4 times a year. We do it by subscription. I know Stan wants to renew his subscription, and we might. Lord, do you want to? I've put some clipboards at the end of the end of the rows there. There's one under you, sir, and you can just grab those. And if you want to get the magazine, all you need to do is there's 3 forms on each clipboard. You can just fill one form in and then take it to the guys, and you can organise a subscription. But it comes out 4 times a year. It's posted to your home. There's a digital subscription that you can get to as well, where you can read on 5 different devices. So, you know, your kids can read it on their phone or their desktop or what have you. And there's also a little box there that you can click under the address. That's what the magazine looks like, the magazine and digital. But we also have a news service we call Info Bites, and there's a little box you can tick on that if you want to get our Info Bites as well. And we have, if you just want the Info Bites, we do have some forms out there you can get, but otherwise we send out these little emails every week or 2 with stuff that's been in the news. Some of the articles, you can get that as well. But the magazine, it's $32 a year, or if you want to get a 3-year subscription, so 3 years at 32, what's that, $96? It's $85 for a 3-year subscription. And I recommend if people haven't got it before, it's really worth getting, apart from being a really attractive Christian, God-honouring magazine. I find most people need to read it for, it's often a year and a half, and they have this experience where the penny drops. All of a sudden, all of the things all make sense, and they start to see the world in a different way, and they realise what the Bible's talking about and what other people are arguing for, and the confusion sort of dissolves. So that's why I recommend you get it for a little bit longer than a year. Now, this lady over here had a question, and we've got a microphone that you can use. Who's got the mic at the back? I can probably hear you anyway.
Yeah, I am reading about evolution. I found it very interesting that it was said the scientists use the fossils in the rock layers to say, like they, oh, thanks. Like the rock scientists will say it must be this old because this fossil is in it, and that fossil existed in that era or whatever. And then the opposite's true as well. They just use it.
There's a circular argument in dating the layers by the fossils and the fossils by the layers. Yeah, there is a little bit of that.
Yeah.
I think the problem that they have is a lot more complicated than that. You know, when you go to school, they're taught the geological column, that there's the Ordovician and the Silurian and the Cretaceous and Jurassic, and there's all those different rocks that all fit in somewhere. But what they don't tell you is there's nowhere on Earth where you can actually see the whole thing. And they believe in what you'd call the onion model, that the layers existed at some point in time all around the Earth. And they called these rocks here in Canberra Ordovician. Well, that's named after a group of rocks in Wales that they believe are part of the same layer and the same age. And that may mean that there were certain fossils that they thought were only in those rocks, which was a good story back 150 years ago, but now most of those fossils have since been found elsewhere anyway, so it kind of blows the picture apart. But, they said that there were those fossils in those rocks, therefore those are Ordovician. We found the same sort of rocks here in Australia, so they're the same age. But there's no one who's ever really proven that these structures are actually the same. They also believe that the rocks that are at the bottom are the old ones and the rocks at the top are the young ones. But then they explain that all of these have been underwater by the fact that the continents move up and down over time. And if that's the case, then they're getting pushed up and eroded off. So which are the older ones, the ones at the bottom or the top? It gets very confusing. I've never heard anyone really answer that, but yes, there is an element of that they can date one with the other, try and correlate. The reality is that they've created a structure, and if you're a geologist and you find a rock, you must fit it into that scheme somewhere. You just have to. And you get paid to write a story of why it ought to be in this particular place until someone comes along with a better story and says, no, it should be somewhere else. And they reclassify it. Stan. Well, yeah, so there's a disagreement in dates on things of known age. And the strange thing is the geologists will say, well, we know that the dating methods that we use for old rocks, if we use them on young rocks, they're notoriously unreliable. They only work on old rocks. It's like, someone's picking my pocket here, I can tell that, if it doesn't work on a rock where you actually know its age, how do you know it's right? Because this is the thing, I'm thinking of a place in the volcano in Mount St Helens in 1980 in Washington State that blew up, produced deposits. There are ones in Hawaii and in New Zealand where the deposits we know from history when they exploded, and so they're using a dating called potassium-argon dating. Argon's a gas that can escape, but the dates that they use with the dating methods give very, very old ages for things that we know are perhaps hundreds or thousands of years old when we know that the actual rock was laid down. Because the theory is that when the rock hardens after the volcanic eruption, that's when the clock starts from. So it should give you the same age, but no, it doesn't. Yeah, there's a lot of anomalies out there.
Sorry. Mine's more of a statement. As most people know, I've got a lot of time on my hands, and all I do is read scripture and investigate all, what would you say, religious scripture. And one of the things that has been highlighted by a number of scholars, as well as myself, is that there's a reason why we only have the Aleppo Codex for the Masoretic texts. It is quite obvious now that 100 years has been taken from the years of everybody who lived after Shem. There's a lot of theories out there why this has been done, but we have about 900 years of the genealogies what are missing in the Masoretic text. They are in the Septuagint and in Josephus as well, names these peoples living 100 years longer than what they really did. What this indicates is that for a reason, probably to discredit Yeshua, the Pharisees began to remove 100 years from everybody who lived from the time of Melchizedek, because one of the claims of the early Christians or the Jewish believers was that Yeshua was in the line of priests of Melchizedek. And it seems that the Pharisees wanted Shem to be Melchizedek. And so they removed 100 years from all the people what lived. According to the Masoretic text, if you look into it, I mean, I've known it for years that there's a problem. I thought there was missing genealogies. But according to the Masoretic text, Shem lived as longer than Abraham did. And that certainly doesn't make sense. And we need to start looking at all of these things from a perspective of an extra 900 years.
What's your name?
Gabriel.
Gabriel raises a very, very interesting historical question, because when we actually ask the question, well, if you go from the Bible, how old is the earth? How long is, when is Genesis 1:1? What's the time? And the reality is that you've got the Samaritan Pentateuch, you've got the Masoretic text, you've got the Septuagint. We've got different textual traditions, and some of the dates vary. But the other thing is that if you're trying to work out an exact date, you think about it. When it tells us that so-and-so begat so-and-so begot so-and-so, it doesn't say what day of the year. Was it at the beginning of the year or the end of the year? Well, that gives you a year difference. And because you've got quite a few generations, a lot of those things add up. One of the other big disputed point is how long was the sojourn in Egypt? And there are two different views. You've got a difference of about 215 years between those two views. So a group of our scientists, and you'd be interested to have a look at this, there's an article at creation.com/biblical age of the earth. And what they did is they looked at all of the things from all of the different textual traditions and all of the things where there's just imprecision in the way the information is communicated, so that we've got a question mark, is it plus or minus a year, or what have you. And then they added all of those things up to get, well, what is the shortest possible age that would agree with all the biblical stuff that we've got, and what is the longest possible age? And what they came up with is that the flood probably occurs somewhere between 2300, 2600 BC, and that the date of creation, the absolute minimum, is 3822 BC to 5665 BC, or in terms of from our year in 2025, somewhere between 5847 and 7690. So round figures, a little bit shorter than 6,000 or a little bit over 7,500 years. All of those age ranges could be argued to agree with the Bible, depending on which textual tradition you're looking at and so on. So it goes into all the detail. You'd probably find it very, very interesting.
Yeah, but I would find from what you just said, that would mean that the pyramids is almost as old as the Tower of Babel, and that the pyramids would have been underwater, under a flood. Do they look like They have been? Is there any evidence?
Well, actually, there was an article just this week I read that was talking about evidence that one of the pyramids may have been underwater.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting find, because up till now, everyone's been arguing that they're post-flood. But maybe that's going to be looked at again. There are lots and lots of interesting topics there, and some of them that we'll never really resolve. I think the thing is that we have to understand what the Bible is and what it isn't. It isn't just the way ancient peoples looked at time and the way they described it is just different. You know, they didn't all have a phone in their pocket that gives them the exact time as everybody else to the second. They didn't have a watch on their arm. They didn't, you know, they thought about time differently. So that's why the way they describe it. And of course, the other thing you've got to take into account is there are a lot of different calendars being used between here and there. And you've got to take all of that into account as well. So it's a very, very complex thing to work out. Of course, you'd all be familiar with the fact that the Jewish calendar was specifically changed from a different time of year on purpose, wasn't it? So we've got two different calendars there. And in our own day, we have our normal calendar and our financial calendar. So.
What do I know about scientists and other people? There's tectonic plate movement of the Earth, because you find South America and Africa move, if you look at them, and they are joined in this great land that the scientists preach about, Gondwana land. And somehow we moved, same as New Zealand, that was in Bondi apparently, thousands of years ago, according to the propaganda. Whether it was true or not, I don't know. And the big problem is we have a tectonic plate movement in the Earth's crust.
Of course, we're dealing with models and theories when we talk about the ancient Earth, aren't we? We've got a certain amount of information and we're trying to explain it. And so there are different models that are popular at different times, and it's really hard to say that this is the exact representation of the truth. It's just what most people think agrees with the facts at a particular point in history. I came across some interesting, when I was looking for photos for slides for this talk, I found some old slides I had of all of the continents arranged. You know how they sort of say, well, they fit together, and so it used to be one thing. Well, this particular one had arranged them all into a few different possibles. One looked like a chicken, one looked like a rat. I can't remember what the third one was, but that it was all the continents rearranged, you know, to fit all nicely fitted together, and it was making fun of the thing. But look, there's good reason to believe that the continents moved in the past. Back in 2016, Elisha and I had the good opportunity to visit Israel for a couple of weeks, and one of the scientists who was there with us was Dr. John Baumgartner, and he's famous for his theory, which is called catastrophic plate tectonics, and he believes that he's shown mathematically that when the right forces are at play, the continental plates can not only move, but the movement can cause enough heat to reduce the friction that they accelerate, and that they can actually move very, very quickly. And he believes that that's what happened in the flood. It's a very popular model at the moment to explain how the things that we see today can be formed very rapidly by processes that the continents do seem to be moving today at a very, very slow level, but we've got big mountain chains that have been pushed up, and I find it much easier to believe that that was pushed up by the inertia of fast-moving plates that collided at the end of the flood. Australia, as example, we've got the whole Great Dividing Range is a fold belt, where the whole continent seems to have folded at that point. But I think the evidence, certainly here in Canberra, is that it's not that you've got this time of when it was under the ocean and there was sedimentation, and then there was another age of volcanism. It seems to me that they're all happening at the same time. It was underwater, it folded, there was volcanism, we've got layers of that, layers of sediment, all interlaying with one another. Then we've got the continent. In fact, it was the continent rising up out of the flood waters that caused it to break. And then we've got the water flowing off the continent. First of all, big sheets, removing a lot of sediment, creating the continental margins that if you go onto Google Maps and zoom out, you can see where all the sediment went to around the margins. And I think the area that we were at just recently, the Hunter Valley, is where a lot of the water from inner New South Wales flowed out to sea. It was a low point, and then it's eroded the whole of the Great Dividing Range there and exposed the coal measures that we're exploiting and utilising. There's coal under a lot of the rest of it, of course. We just can't get to it. It's covered with the sandstone. But what's coal? Masses of buried trees. How did they all get buried together? Well, there's a great documentary, you can even watch it free online now, about Mount St Helens and what happened there, and how 1 million trees were removed from the sides of hills in just seconds from that explosion of Mount St Helens. And those trees were all floating in a log, rubbing together and dropping their bark at the bottom. Well, what's coal mostly made of? Bark. Anyway, interesting story. We might make this the last one because I don't know what's happening next and how we're going for time. We've got time for one more question? Yeah?
Well, just in 2 Peter 3:8, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with God the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. So we know maybe it took 6,000 years, and on the seventh day, here we are, Sabbath, we rested, or he rested. So instead of 6 days, maybe it was 6,000 years.
I suppose the question is, if that was true, how would that help reconcile with the idea that Western Australia is 2.4 billion years old? There's a big difference between 6,000, 10,000, 600,000 and 2.4 billion years. They're just on a completely different scale. But I think it's worth remembering the context, of course, of that passage. What's Peter talking about? He's explaining the patience of God, and that God doesn't deal with time like we do. But I think we saw quite clearly that the way God works when he makes things is he does it as quick as he wants. He doesn't have a time limit. He doesn't need a long process. And he could have done it in a long time period. But it's quite clear in Exodus 20, isn't it, that he tells us the reason he did it in 7 days is 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you will rest. He gives them that pattern. And we know what that means. We know how long a week is. We know how long we're supposed to work. We know how long we're supposed to rest. And it doesn't make any sense if that's not what God's week was. That's right. Yom is like the word day in English.
Well, the Bible says the evening and the morning, one day.
That's right. Yeah, well, that's what determines the meaning of the word yom there, because it's just like English. I can use the word day in different sentences, and I can use it to mean a 24-hour day, the day time. So I can talk about the sunlight part of the day, and I can use the word day to mean all of those things, and you'll know exactly what I mean by how my sentence is constructed. And of course, you've pointed out there that Moses in Genesis 1 has gone out of his way to use all the things that I identify when we mean a 24-hour day by saying, well, there was an evening, there was a morning, it was number 1, it was number 2, number 3. All of those things which linguistically we use to define what the day means in that context. And of course, when we look at Jonah, and he's in the big fish. How long is he there? Do we know what that means, how long that was? I think we do, don't we? Yeah, because the context makes it clear what a day is in that context. No one questions that. It's the same word, of course, yom, but we know what kind of day it's talking about because the context makes it clear.